It is my privilege to be able to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Neville Speer. Dr. Speer is a professor in the Animal Science Department at Western Kentucky University, also the program director of leadership studies at Western Kentucky. So he wears a couple of big hats there. He's a native of Colorado. He got his BS, MS, and PhD, and that Martian is trying to land on the microphone here. Got all three of his degrees at Colorado State University, and then later picked up an MBA at Western Kentucky University. He's an animal scientist, an economist, and really an ag and beef industry issues specialist. He tries to keep up and does an excellent job of doing all this. He has to be a voracious reader to keep up with everything that he puts out in the way of information, because he's also a very prolific writer, writing the monthly market profile, which is now in its 9th year, talking about breed, current events and situations. He writes a Beef Biz column for Calf News. He's contributing editor there, and this year he started another column called Ag Site, where he discusses issues impacting agriculture. Today, Dr. Speer is going to be talking to us about implications of federal policy changes for U.S. beef producers. So if you would, please help me welcome Dr. Speer. Thank you. Yep. Thank you. I have to go with this.
Oh, we got to use it. This one's not working. It's good. Test, test. Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to participate in today's session. I'll tell you, my only regret is that I wasn't able to be with you last night, because I think you honored a wonderful person in Warren Weibert. He truly is a leader in this industry. He's a great mind and just a wonderful businessman and a guy with great character. And I can't think of anybody more fitting to do that, and I wish I could have been here last night. Well, my task today is to talk about policy, and that's a big job, and I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I'll kind of give you where I think we're headed. I'll tell you the first thing is, when we start talking about policy, we kind of imply that we're dealing with politics. And it's typically pretty hazardous duty, because I don't know much middle ground, especially right now in terms of politics. It's pretty much either one way or the other. I hope that I can give you a perspective that I think is pretty objective. And I want to just maybe kind of give you some insight into where I believe we're headed and what I think we need to look out for, versus kind of giving you this big ideological spurge that I don't think is really necessary. I wrote in my article in January, you kind of always want to start off the year with, where are we headed and where have we been in the previous year. And I kind of had 3 themes that I think are important relative to our industry. And in some ways, they're really all related. And that's the shrinking revenue that we're experiencing in this industry. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Market volatility is always an issue, and increasingly an issue. And I actually spent some time yesterday with some students. I'm teaching a class in the futures market, and they're beginning to experience market volatility. They have pretend accounts and having to make margin calls, and beginning to understand how challenging this business can be. But then lastly is the policy. We have a new administration. We are looking forward to 4 or 8 years of kind of new policy implementation. And it's going to impact our business one way or the other. So certainly a major issue as we move forward. Part of the challenge here is I don't know what issues really to deal with. There are so many coming at this particular industry right now. And it seems like we say it all the time, but there's probably no more critical time than right now. I don't think we have answers for all of those, but there are just a ton of issues as we deal with these. I'm going to kind of try to deal with maybe about the first half of those, recognizing that I just can't, in what time I have allotted here, to really touch base on all of them. And I recognize that and apologize that, but I just want to kind of get to the bigger issues that we have to deal with, and then maybe we can move forward and talk about some of the others in the question and answer period. Well, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the economy, and I know everybody's sort of tired of hearing about it, but it's important. It's where we are as a country, and I think it's extremely important to our industry, and I want to spend some time there because I think sometimes as an industry, we tend to maybe separate ourselves a little bit from the broader economy and say, well, that's going on out there. We're buffered. We're impacted. No, I think actually we're very much impacted, and we don't have anybody really taking care of us. So I think it is important, and we are in a dark wood, and the way is not straight, and we're trying to figure out these answers day by day. It's interesting to me that I went back and dug through some stuff that I wrote, and it was back in March 2003, we were talking about this, about what was going on in terms of credit applications and what we were doing in terms of the industry, the financial industry, in terms of allowing mortgages that probably weren't very well secured. We were selling these derivatives and what have you, and we were the benefactors of that, though, because we were getting people to kind of cash in on the equity that they were getting in their house, and they were spending very rapidly. And I'll show you some slides or slide relative to that. But at some point, we recognized that just wasn't sustainable, that ultimately the dependability of the consumer has to be called into question, that we just can't continue to go on this way. And at that point, I was probably a little early, but saying that we really have to begin to manage our risk more and more carefully because the business implications are very important to our industry as we move forward. Well, let's fast forward, and we started kind of picking up on this in late 2007, and then obviously in 2008, you know what? The consumer ran out of gas. And I think we've all been impacted by that one way or the other, and really what's going on is we've seen these businesses have to deal with restructuring, but we're also seeing consumers, individuals, as they're trying to kind of strengthen up their balance sheet because they're not wanting to borrow any more money. They can't borrow money because they have too much debt already. And ultimately what's happening is we're getting consumers not spending money, and we're slowing down the entire economy. And a lot of people talk about, well, we need to fix the banks. And yes, we do need to fix the banks, but ultimately what we're trying to do is fix the consumer. We got to fix the banks so we can fix the consumer. And as an industry, we're taking some big hits there because we're seeing a rotation away from restaurants because of decreased travel and leisure dining over to retail. So we're losing money that way. And then we're seeing this rotation also away from beef, more so to pork and poultry. And the best kind of take-home example, and I show my students this, I always tell my students, you got to understand the choice cutout. It's the benchmark really for where we are in this industry, what's going on with consumers. And, when we understand wholesale trade, I think we kind of get a pretty good indication of general economic matters as it applies to our industry. And we've chopped along here in the last couple of years and found pretty good support at 140. And we had a wonderful summer. We got that choice cut out to up to 170 last July, which was contra-seasonal. And that was because we had some stimulus money in our pockets, and all of a sudden we went out and we started spending money at restaurants, and we went shopping, and we got to move some beef in a very contra-seasonal manner at much higher values, and it was all good. And you go, woohoo! But if you look at the graph from where we've gone since then, it's basically a very negative trend. And unfortunately, what's happened in the last month or so is that we have broken through that very important support level of 140. We broke through at 136 and recognized that that's about $10 or $11 per hundredweight off of the average of the previous 3 years. And so, you start adding that up, that's well $100, $90 to $100 per head that we have taken away. And I'll show you some bigger implications to that as we go through. But that's really the bottom line. That's the impact of what's going on in terms of discretionary spending is declining. We're taking a hit at the cutout, and obviously everything prices back from that. Well, here we are. We're dealing with trying to fix the economy, and we're throwing a lot of money out there, and we're printing money. The question becomes, and I think it's a very important question for us as a beef industry, are there some unintended consequences? Obviously, there are to the broader economy, but also what's going to happen to us because of some potential unintended consequences. You know, we're trying to fix the banks, and so we can fix the consumers, as I mentioned earlier, and that's a big job. And you know, I really like how Martin Wolf put it. He writes for the Financial Times, and he just wrote this past weekend. He said, you know, these banks, they're too complex to manage, they're too big to fail, and they're too hard to restructure. And that's sort of where we're finding ourselves. And I think yesterday was a pretty good indication of that. Citi broke through $1. You know, it's now a penny stock. Who would have ever guessed that, even 5 years ago, that Citi would be trading for less than $1? And it really kind of speaks to the challenges that we have out there in terms of the overall economy and trying to fix it. Well, when's it going to get back to normal? Because that's always the question. Okay, it's terrible. It's just no good. When do we get back to normal? Well, it sure probably isn't going to happen this year. It's probably not going to happen next year, maybe 2 years. This is a survey that came from Deutsche Bank, where they had a conference, and, you know, they bring in financial people from all over, and this is sort of their general consensus. Is it perfect? No, but this is sort of their outlook, saying, hey, this is where we are, and this is not going to happen right away. And even though we're hoping, and we talk a lot about that we're going to have this dramatic recovery all of a sudden in 2009, probably getting back to normal in terms of securitization in the financial industry, and then ultimately where consumers feel comfortable about having some credit availability, and obviously then their home values kind of shore up in spending, we're probably still a year or two away. And that's somewhat troubling and somewhat important. But, you know, I like how Warren Buffett talked about it in terms of, okay, we're dumping all of this money into this industry, into all these industries, and where it goes. And you know, I like how he said, you know, the Treasury and the Fed, they've gone all in. They've put all this money in, and they've kind of used to kind of give it out by the cupful, and now all of a sudden it's this one big kind of barrel full, and we just keep throwing water. But what I really liked is that once we've given money to these entities, it's very hard to wean them away from it. They're accustomed to it. And so, you know, that's going to be a big political challenge. Once you've kind of got them on the dole, getting them off the dole is going to be really difficult, and they're not going to leave very willingly, okay? Well, what does that mean as we move forward? Ultimately, as you start putting all this money in to these industries with stimulus and bailout money, is that good? No, this is probably where we begin to get the unintended consequences, okay? Is that we kind of create this disincentive to achieve. We begin to create systems where we kind of alter the risk-reward estimates, and ultimately we have these companies that are kind of dead at their core, like Citi or GM, and we've put money in there, but they're kind of staggering with life. They're kind of hanging on because we've given them money. But ultimately what happens is that causes a decline in GDP because these companies are not being productive. They are sucking off, and they are taking potential investment money away from private industry because the government now has overshadowed that, okay? And the Congressional Budget Office says that ultimately stimulus is going to be harmful over the long run. Or I like how Mohammed El-Arian says it, you know, that aggressive government involvement runs counter to our system of thinking in terms of markets, and it should be minimized. But ultimately, what I want you to take home with that is it's about the GDP, that we potentially, the unintended consequences are we're causing a decline in GDP, and therefore we're going to have less spending, and that ultimately feeds back into the cutout of, for example, the graph that I just showed you. Now, what's the ultimate outcome? Okay, we can talk about all of that in terms of big terms, but what does that ultimately mean for our industry? Well, I've played with some data here in the last few months, and you know, ultimately, the money for the production sector comes from the feed yard. Okay, that ultimately is the best gauge that we have, really, of money available flowing in to the production sector is what comes out of feed yards. And so I began kind of calculating, guesstimating. Okay, it's not perfect, but if you take our total marketings and you multiply that by the Fed market value every month, you can get some general idea. And again, here what's important is the delta or the trend, but we can get some general idea of the overall revenue coming into this industry that's available, okay? And again, these are, please note, these are big numbers. These are in billions of dollars. But if you look at the trend, that's what's important, is you can see that we had a wonderful July, right? That's that $170 cutout that we had. We were moving beef, and all of a sudden, exports were picking up, and things were good, and that's all great. But look what's happened in the last 3 months relative to the previous 3-year average. We're off by over $500 million. Now, that's a $2 billion difference annualized. That means that if that trend continues, that's $2 billion less coming into our production sector than maybe what came in a year ago. That has huge implications all the way back. Because now all of a sudden we don't have as much readily available cash to do all kinds of things like buy animal health products or buy feed or do the extra things, deferred maintenance, what have you. And it also says we're probably going to have to bid down feeder cattle because we just don't have the cash flow. Bankers are they recognize this. In fact, I think this is what explains largely what happened earlier this fall when we broke the market $6 in 1 week, is that we're trying to shore up those balance sheets and we're in trouble. Now, what that says is what's going to happen to our infrastructure in this industry. So what we have my point being, in terms of policy, we don't typically think of ourselves as actively engaged in economic policy, but we really are actively engaged in economic policy, and we need to be, because we need consumers spending money so that we can keep some prosperity in terms of the production sector, and it has a very, very real impact on us, and that's important, and I want you to be aware of that and think about that as we move forward. Okay, that's a big topic, but I want to move on, because I want to talk about country of origin labeling, and that's, boy, if there's ever hazardous duty or a tough issue or a hot button, it's big. But I think it's really important, and the circumstances surrounding country of origin labeling have changed dramatically in the last 6 to 8 weeks, primarily since January 20th with the new administration. We really are in a whole new environment in terms of what we're going to do with this policy and what it's going to happen and what the implications are. And by the way, this is the title for my ag site this coming month, is Country of Origin Labeling. Last month it was Much Ado About Cool, and I thought, well, we can kind of end there and put it away. No, we got a whole nother month of this, and I'm going to talk about that. We talk a lot about moral hazard in the general economy and stimulus and all of that. We got moral hazard here, and I'll show you why. And the timing here is just terrible. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why that is and what's going to happen in terms of the beef sector. Here we are. It's January 2009, and we thought we kind of had country of origin labeling settled 6 years ago. I had written an article, a white paper that was printed on the front cover of Feedstuffs at the NCBA convention in 2003. And part of what I included in that was that success of country origin labeling would be evaluated in 2 ways. One, that it provided consumers with some meaningful information and create value at a reasonable cost, okay? And then also to kind of give us U.S. producers some comparative advantage over their foreign competitors. Well, we all know the history of country of origin labeling, and we kind of put it aside, and none of that really mattered, and we kept talking about it and beating it around, and here we are 6 years later, and now it really does matter. I think that we need to kind of deal with what's the rationalization for the law, and I think we need to look at that very objectively, and the rationalization is, and that's fine, is that it's a consumer right-to-know issue. Oftentimes we kind of blend food safety into that, and that somehow we would create differential demand curves, that products from the U.S. would have very different demand curves, or somewhat different, therefore worth more money than products that come from other countries. Well, on the other side of that is that we do have country of origin labeling available to us and have had it available to us through a voluntary system. We didn't need to go through a provision or a government mandate to get this. The other thing that's interesting to me is, as we talk about food safety, is that all of these products, and I'm talking about the beef industry here primarily, they all go through the same grading system, that they all are assumed and presumed to be inspected equally and equally safe, and therefore the food safety issue is interesting to me. The demand impact, that's hard to know. We won't know that for a very, very long time. You can't measure that and you can't project that, and it's especially muddier, messier now with the economy the way it is. But what's most troubling to me, I guess, as I look at this, is there's this huge opportunity cost, is that we have spent 6 years dealing with country of origin labeling. What kind of resources could we have been doing to create value or do other things besides kind of dealing with this law? And that's one thing that we will never get a handle on, but I do think that there's been a pretty big opportunity cost. But one thing that we need to remember ultimately, and it goes back to that, can we create value at a reasonable cost, is we are labeling every single product every single day. That is a huge task in our industry. Every single product, every single day. And there's a lot of cost involved with that. And so I wrote last month that that's a pretty steep risk-reward proposition at this point. But all that being said, things have changed dramatically. All of a sudden, we have Secretary Vilsack, who's kind of changed the game on us a little bit. And he begins to kind of create this threshold of compliance. And one of the guys that I work with in leadership studies, he's a retired lieutenant colonel. He's been through Ranger School, and I always like the way he thinks, and he kind of, he's taught me a lot about military thinking, but he likes to use the term dark target, right? It's not a moving target, it's a dark target. And so the question becomes is, what is the threshold of compliance there? And so Vilsack says that processors should voluntarily include information about what production step occurred in each country when multiple countries appear on the label. Okay? And then he goes on to say that they will be reviewing this compliance, and that depending on this performance, I will carefully consider whether modifications to the rule will be necessary to achieve the intent of Congress. Well, that's the moral hazard right there. Because if I'm processor A, I'm going to let processor B do it, because I don't want to add any costs voluntarily. I'm going to let them do it, and hopefully they kind of make sure that the entire industry mean gets pulled up in terms of compliance. And that's where we have created moral hazard. It's a little different approach in a little different way, but it's moral hazard that you do it, I'm not going to do it because I don't have an economic incentive, so I'm going to lay it on you. And we'll voluntarily all kind of do this, and you do more of it than I will. And so ultimately what we've created is this situation is that there's that's the dark target, no specific kind of carrot of promise. It's just kind of this stick to avoid further mandates. Well, I think that's especially important in this particular environment as we talk about economics. And this is like one of my favorite graphs. And I always like to come back to this. I don't know why, but I'm always fascinated by what's going on in terms of overall expenditures. And remember that we don't purchase anything in isolation. We always purchase product in comparison to some other competing product. When we go to the grocery store, most people, okay, what's a pound of hamburger cost? What does that compare to pork and or poultry? And we make comparative assumptions. Now, most of us, some of us in this room aren't old enough, but many of us are old enough to remember what happened for about 20 years between 1980 and 1998. The beef industry got their butts kicked. The competition gained about $112 over that 18 years in new spending. We got 6. Why is that? Well, we were getting beat up in the media, and all of a sudden we had this, right, red meat was terrible, and it was not good for you, and it was going to cause heart attacks, and you were going to fall over and die, and if you ate it, and we still have some of that going on today, and that's kind of renewed. But, the biggest thing that happened is we had a lot of waste. And many of you will remember this is the value-based task force, and ultimately we got to the beef quality audit. What happened was our cost structure was out of line relative to those other two industries. They were becoming much more efficient, right? And so we had this very huge disadvantage in terms of cost-value relationship. So we didn't get any new spending. 20 years, no new money. And you can remember, those of you that sold fed cattle in 1998, that's about as bad as it got, okay? Well, if we kind of then go to the next 6 or 8 years, it got better. All of a sudden, people began to realize that, you know what, beef tastes good. We really do like it, and we don't really care if it's bad for us. And we became more competitive in terms of our cost structure. And then the other thing that occurred was we had that wonderful diet, Atkins. All of a sudden, beef was good for you. And we kind of topped out at 2004. Now, let's project out from 2008. These are USDA figures. Are they perfect? No. But what's important, again, is not the actual values. It's the delta or the trend. Look what's happening in the difference between beef expenditures and the competition. We're going to be kind of getting behind, and this really doesn't take in the fact that we are in a declining economy. This may be even worse. Now, my point in saying that is this is important relative to country origin labeling, because which industry is going to have the greatest costs to implement country of origin labeling? We will, because we're the most fragmented and the most segmented. So we are inherently at a big disadvantage as we talk about country of origin labeling relative to those other industries. That's the miserable timing. This couldn't have come at a worse time as we talk about that. Well, the new laws and the new comments that are coming out of the administration have encouraged the Canadian Cattlemen's Association to renew their WTO complaint, and that's somewhat troubling. They're our trade partners, and interestingly enough, this did not come up in conversation publicly, at least, as President Obama went to Canada 2 weeks ago, but it's certainly important, and there's certainly a lot of angst there, and recognize that Mexico has already filed a WTO complaint, and so we probably will have our two NAFTA partners, if this plays out, going to WTO saying that country of origin labeling is illegal, and basically it represents a non-tariff trade barrier. You are illegally discriminating against our product. And that's really troubling from a pragmatic perspective, because all of a sudden, our trade partners have bailed us out since 2003. We've created a lot of value by enabling our product to go to those two countries. And if you look at what's happened in terms of total dollars, we got to $3.6 billion in terms of export trade this last year in 2008. That's the highest level since 2003. And remember, we got cut off. And what's interesting is that Canada and Mexico account for about 58% of that, or $95 per head. Now, if they don't like what we're doing here, guess what they're going to do in terms of our imports? It's tit for tat. They're going to shut us off. And we're going to lose our biggest markets in terms of export trade. And this is really important. And as we've talked about, we don't have enough buffer, enough cushion to grow domestically. This is where we get extra value. So when we begin to hear all of this stuff about Buy American, and actually there was a letter in Congress floating around last week to redo WTO, renegotiate NAFTA, and renegotiate South Korea. We need South Korea and we need NAFTA because we need to keep moving trade. But ultimately, it's principled and pragmatic. Trade is principled and it's very pragmatic, okay? And what I really like is how Sally puts it, is that free trade is part and parcel of free markets. We believe in free markets. I think this industry has always stood for free markets, and we recognize that if we can compete domestically, we can compete internationally, and everyone gains from that. And ultimately, what happened in 2008, we had a positive trade balance in the beef industry. That's the first time since 2003. It was $1 billion positive trade balance. Now in 2003, it was twice that, and we all know how tough it's been to get back in those markets and how much work it has been. And so, we may be taking a pretty big step backwards. Okay, big issue, very, very important, huge. I want to change subjects then. I think all of us recognize that we're changing subjects completely, but all of us recognize how important this has been in terms of peanut butter. I mean, we've all read it, we've all been involved in it, and I like how Senator Harkin put it, right? What's more sacred than peanut butter? And I think we need to recognize that just a year ago we had what was then the largest recall in history, okay, Hallmark and Westland, and that was for a very different reason and not necessarily well substantiated, but it occurred nonetheless. This is now the largest recall in history in terms of total product, duration. 677 people have been sick, half of them are children, 9 deaths, over 2,000 products. I think Costco has made in excess of 2 million phone calls. We've gotten notices in the mail from Kroger. We buy Cliff Bars, and so that's the value of those purchasing club types of communication, is they can get that kind of stuff back to you. And so this has been a big issue. And can you imagine trying to get over 2,000 different products in different countries back? That's a big challenge in terms of tracing all of that. This hits home for me, though, a little bit. I have a daughter who's 4.5 years old, and of course she's the greatest kid in the world, right? She and her dad like to eat peanut butter crackers. And she goes to a pre through 8th grade school. And I happen to be on the school council there. She'll go there for the next 8 years. And she goes to preschool 5 days a week, And one day we meet the 4th Monday of every month for school council. And a couple of months ago, the principal told us that she got a phone call that she had to pull all the peanut butter out of the kitchen because it indeed had been recalled. Now my heart kind of goes, wow, okay? It strikes home with you. Luckily, we live about 30 miles from the new Smucker's Crustable peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, so she can still have peanut butter and jelly every day for lunch, right? Because that's what she eats. But it's important. And, I was really reminded of that. I just thought this was this wonderful picture. This is this little boy that got sick, and his dad testified. But, it could be any of our kids, just any of them. And it's nothing really that we can prevent or go forward with. And so this really strikes home for all of us as we go forward. So ultimately, public perception, it really does matter. And what's going on. I'll tell you, I probably like the way Larry Pope said it best about a year ago at the USDA Outlook Forum. He was talking about Hallmark Westland. We were about a week after that had been announced. He stood up. He was evangelical that day. I don't know. He was just on fire. I've never heard him talk quite that way, quite that strongly. But ultimately what he said is that each recall causes people to trust us a little bit less. And whether they're substantiated or not, it happens, and it impacts consumers, and therefore it impacts us as an industry. And it doesn't matter whether it's spinach or peanut butter or beef. We're all in it together because we're all food producers, and we are feeding people and their families, and it's a consumable, and they're very emotional about it, and that was his point. And he was kind of angry that he had to deal with it. And he didn't have to deal with it directly, but saying, I'm getting these phone calls. We're all in this boat together. And so public perception, really, really does happen. And so, what do we do with that? Well, it's not only about public perception. There's also a very real economic cost to this, okay? And you can see that the direct costs for all of these, and who knows how many hundreds of millions of dollars, Hallmark and Westland had to deal with. Obviously, Peanut Corp, they've filed for bankruptcy, and who knows what all of this is going to cost. And so there's direct costs, but the indirect costs are all of these things. Investigative, you got to lose your inventory, you got to remove inventory, legal fees, loss of sales, and I know Walmart, when they went through the melamine thing and the dog food, they said they don't ever want to do that again. because the costs were huge. And so that impacts all of us. But probably what's most important is when we start dealing with compliance, where does it play out? It plays out in the public. That doesn't happen in boardrooms and with the government. It plays out in the public. It's hard to probably pick up a newspaper in the last month that during a day of the week that there hasn't been something in there about all of this. Well, there's certainly a move afoot, and this has been active this very week about restructuring FDA, and I liked how Rosa DeLauro put it in her letter. She wrote this letter to the Wall Street Journal relative to an article called Peanut Butter Justice. And so, her argument is this is just the latest in a long line of contaminated foods. And her point being is that we have to transform the bureaucracy to prevent foodborne illnesses, not just react to them. And I want to say, you know what? We do a pretty good job. We have the safest food structure in the food industry in the entire world, but recognize what she's dealing with as a politician. Well, sure enough, just this week, Senator Durbin over on the Senate side introduces the Food Safety Modernization Act, and in doing this very thing is that we're going to change the structure of FDA. Okay? Now, does that impact us directly? No, but what does is when we begin to see this kind of legislation being introduced. Tracing and Recalling Agricultural Contamination Everywhere Act. Notice the intent of the law. Establishes a product tracing system for all food products from their origin to the market. What's that sound like? That's NACE. That's NAIS. I was in Washington last week. There is some talk that we are definitely going to renew NACE. And in fact, the House Ag Committee is having a hearing on it next week, whether that really happens. But recognize this is coming from a totally different perspective. And it may have some very important implications as we start moving forward relative to animal ID. Okay, business. Lots of stuff going on out there in terms of business, and you got to try to hang on, okay? Hang on to the ball. But it's important. I think one of the biggest things that we have to talk about in this industry is the Enhanced Feed Ban Act. And that's implemented in April 27th. I deal with a very large, we work closely at school with a very large stocker, operator, backgrounder. They probably trade somewhere in the vicinity of 100,000 head a year, if not more. We're dealing with them on a project because they're very concerned about this, because they're not going to be able to have any pickups. Our renderer has already said, we're done picking up. Now, the first response is, okay, what we do with our deads is that we are going to compost them. Well, at the level at which they operate, State Veterinary Office told them they're going to have about 200 acres. Well, I don't think they're going to set aside 200 acres to compost dead animals, and I'm not sure their neighbors are going to go for that. Now, they're looking into making a huge investment in terms of grinding them up and composting them, and that's what we are working on. But that's a huge investment, huge implications. The reality is it ultimately may put them out of business where they just can't function anymore. Okay? When you start dealing with 50 to 100 deads a week, whatever it is, that becomes challenging. 25. What do you do with those, especially in July when they've been sitting there for 5 days? Your neighbors are not going to be very, very happy. Now, you can say, well, that's in Kentucky. But you know where they send a lot of their cattle? Out here, right? They're all coming here. So this could potentially create this very major backup in the system. And I think we need to be aware of that. Again, I don't think we've even begun to think about the unintended consequences of this law, but it's huge, and it potentially could put people out of business. Packer ownership. Oh, here we go again, round 3. Secretary Vilsack has said very openly in an interview that he did earlier this fall that he agrees with Obama's support for the provision in the Farm Bill. We fought that, and that's ultimately how we got country of origin labeling, okay? Back in 2002 is that we'd kind of give up on packer ownership in trade for country of origin labeling. Well, here we are. I find it interesting that government is allowing us to kind of continue to come back and check on this law and check on this law. You know, we just paid RTI, I don't know how many millions of dollars to do this pretty major study, which they released 2 years ago to kind of give us the definitive answer on this question, and so we're back to it. And ultimately, their answer was that because the percentage of packer-owned cattle is small, less than 5%, a policy, any new policy, really isn't going to change anything that much. And it really won't change much for packers, but you know who it's going to change it for is producers, for feedlot owners, and ultimately stockers and cow-calf people, because it really does, even if it's a little bit, and especially now in this day and age, it reduces the need for equity. If you could get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% of your cattle in your feed yard owned by somebody else, that's great, okay? Because it's hard to get capital, and you don't want to put that capital at risk. And so getting that capital, you got to get some higher rates of return. And if not, then you're going to have more risk as you move forward. And ultimately, I think what it does is it limits producers in terms of what they can do, who they can sell to, and who can do what. And that's sort of the principle in all of that. And, you know, whether you agree or disagree with that, I think it's important that we look at those things pretty pragmatically as we look at debt structure, availability to capital, and ultimately the principles of free market. But what really troubles me is it kind of makes packers, I think it's a misplaced focus, because it makes packers this big evil entity, you know, and we were talking down there earlier this morning, but if you go back and you look at sort of the profitability in these industries, this is Tyson. This is historical information over the last 5 years. Look at their operating margin for beef relative to prepared foods, chicken, and pork. I've often said I think probably Tyson wonders every day why they ever bought IBP. Now, they haven't done much to change it, and I hope nobody in here, somebody may be in here that works for them, and that's fine, but, you know, this is important. But also look at, you know, we talk about alpha, investing. That's your return over risk. There's your biggest risk, lowest return. This is an awful kind of alpha model. This is by far the best alpha model, okay? We don't want all of that downside risk and very little rate of return. Pork is nearly 9 times better return than beef. And so, you know, we just maybe need to kind of look at what are we really trying to do here? Who's really the enemy as we talk about adversarial things? Okay, lots of kind of ideological things that I think are important. And, you know, we talk about cow tax and you know, global warming and whatever, you know, and so there's lots of issues out there that activists can protest against our industry because we're poisoning the environment and doing all of that. Clearly, animal welfare is one of the biggest issues. And by the way, this is a picture of a lady who was at Phoenix at National Cattlemen's just this couple of months ago, back in the end of January. She painted herself all up and laid on this for a couple of hours, and it was on the front page of the Phoenix paper the day I left, and so I don't know, she's topless. Maybe a lot of people are out there checking her out. I don't know, but anyway, what's interesting is that in Europe it's becoming a very real issue, and it was a discussion relative to WTO, the World Trade Organization. Should animal welfare be included? Well, now you can say, well, that's kind of wacky, and that's not very important, and that's over there. But what happens over there ultimately is going to kind of drift here. And Europe has some very serious things going on, and I have some firsthand insight into that. I, last fall, just about 4 months ago, reviewed a paper entitled Livestock Road Transportation in European Union. And it was talking about 5 different policy options. Now, I can't give you all of the details because I signed a proprietary agreement. But I can tell you what I wrote back to them, my comments relative to the paper. And I asked the question, is the overarching intention, because you get a theme out of this, right, to diminish livestock transport? And obviously, if you diminish livestock transport, what do? You close off markets, you create an inability to do business, what have you. And I mean, some of these things were, I mean, it was amazing, okay? And they're very into loading and unloading cattle. You know, they've been, and so I just need to be careful. But Then I ask the question, if that's really your intention, don't hide it. Just come out with it, create a policy, and do it. Don't create all of these other things where we have to kind of crimp down and be frustrated with it. You know, that's the reality. And so let's just say we're going to limit it, and that's it, and that's what we value. Well, again, you can say that's over there, but there are some things happening here. And relative to policy, brand new Congressional Animal Protection Caucus, okay, committed to raising the awareness of animal welfare issues in Congress, creating and promoting legislation protecting animals nationwide, and working with Humane Society of the United States and Humane Society Legislative Fund. And Wayne Pacelli says the caucus will better align public opinion and public policies. That's huge. When Wayne Pacelli's involved, HSUS, we better wake up. Okay? It's coming, and this is important, and that deals with policy. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about ideology, and we'll finish up here. Clearly, it's a new administration, 4 or 8 years. I think we need to recognize where we are. It's a very different time. It's a very different place than what we've had in the previous 8 years or maybe even the previous 16 years. And I think you need to be aware of some of the nuances that are coming because I think it has some important implications. I don't know what's happened. I heard a guy say the other day that he knew that who ran the remote. I'm going backwards. How did that happen? It is going backwards. Okay. Larry, you may have to sit there. I don't know. These are the stated priorities from the Obama administration. This is on their website. Strong safety net for family farmers. Anti-competitive behavior against family farms. We've talked about that a little bit indirectly. CAFOs, country of origin labeling, organic local agriculture. Encourage young people to become farmers. Oh, Larry, I don't know what I did to it. I'm sorry. We only have a few more. So, last week, Secretary Vilsack at the Outlook Forum said when he took the job, President Obama, he said, what do you want to happen in the Department of Agriculture at USDA? And President Obama said, these are the 3 priorities. We want to have more nutritious food. We want to increase alternative energy opportunities. And third, we want to transition agriculture from a dependence on fossil fuels. Now, I have to stop and ask myself, what does that mean? What industry isn't dependent on fossil fuels, and why are we kind of sorted out? And you can say, well, you know, that's just something he said, and, you know, wherever he goes. Okay, Larry, I'm sorry about that. That's right in line, and many of you have probably read this quote from what President Obama said in Time magazine. Okay? I was just reading an article in the New York Times by Michael Pollan about food and the fact that our entire ag system is built on cheap oil. Well, I hope it's built on a lot more than that, okay, because I believe it is. But as a consequence, our agriculture sector actually is contributing more greenhouse gases than our transportation sector. It's creating monocultures that are vulnerable to national security threats, sky-high food prices, huge swings in commodity prices, and are partly responsible for the explosion in our health care costs because they're contributing to type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart disease, obesity. You see all that stuff tied in there together? Cheap oil, agriculture, health problems, obesity. We're it. We're the cause of it all somehow, and we got to fix it. Okay? The point is that the pressure's coming. Go ahead, Larry. Now, you can say, okay, well, you're making too much of that, but begin to see the theme here. Remember who was a very important supporter of President Obama? Was Oprah. She just went through a vegan cleanse, and I found what's very interesting. It wasn't just about her body, but notice the health, environmental, and spiritual implications. So in other words, if you eat meat, you're having negative health, spiritual, and environmental implications. And then she also mentioned Nicholas Kristof's New York Times article about the rights of livestock. And I would encourage you to go read that, and just so that you're aware of that. Go ahead, Larry. Okay? Well, just last week, Kathleen Merrigan was named Deputy Secretary. That's all well and good, and she's very known for sustainability and organic kind of stuff. But you know what troubles me? Is out there in the web land, She is named one of the Sustainable Dozen. And it was described as this: a list of progressive, reformed-minded candidates for Deputy Ag Secretary that was compiled by Food Democracy Now! Go to Food Democracy Now! It is supported by Free Range Studios. Free Range Studios created The Matrix, which is about as anti-meat negative what we do in this business as you can get. I show it to my students just so that they understand what's going out there in terms of the real world. Okay? It's important. Okay. Go ahead, Larry. So, maybe we better hurry up and let's eat a whole lot of meat before we can't anymore, right? And so, anyway, right? That's kind of the point. Okay, Larry. I think bottom line, do I know all the answers? No, but maybe I pretend to know. I don't, even that. It's a joke. But, right, that policy is going to impact our business more so than ever. And I don't mean that to be, the sky is falling, but it's really, really important as we go forward. I think we need to recognize that of the 535 members of Congress right now, how many of them have direct livestock or ag backgrounds? 12. Okay? That's about 2%. That represents about us. Okay? Are they going to vote for us every time? Probably not. It's important we recognize that. Go ahead, Larry. I think one of the things that we have to continue as an industry, remind people out there, we like to get painted with a lot of different brushes by the general public. You know what? We're primarily run by very well-managed, well-intentioned family businesses that feed 70% of the world. Okay? We create almost all of that from family businesses. And people want to get really hung up on size. And I went to a large producer seminar at the University of Purdue this fall. And they were interviewing. They did some producer panels. And this guy farms 5,000 acres and he milks 3,000 cows. And the question came up about that. And he said, you know what? I'm not going to exploit anything. You know why? Because I want to give this to my kids. If I exploit it, then I'm just using it up for me. I want to give it to my kids. And I think we need to keep telling that story over and over and over, because the goal is to pass it along to the next generation. So it's very easy to get cynical and defeated, right? And all these political promises and we can't do that. We've got to stay positive. And sometimes that's how we feel. We're just like, oh, it's a bunch of politicians. This policy's terrible. And, right, it's a bunch of poo pumpers. Right? Okay, but we need to kind of keep forward and moving forward. And I think right now in this industry and where we are, we can make absolutely no assumptions. Don't assume the bridge is going to work. Okay? And I try to tell producers all the time, and everyone in this industry, we've got to be objective. Sometimes we get focused on the wrong stuff. And we have to be informed, and we more than ever, have to manage risk. And, shit's going to happen. But we've got to be proactive. And so if I had one take-home message today, is to get engaged. Sometimes this stuff seems kind of ambiguous, and we're going to just wait and see what happens. No, if you have a care, and whether, regardless of what side of the aisle or however you feel about an issue, we need to get involved so that we're not trying to put out a fire later that you don't want, with this little bitty bucket. And with that, I would answer any questions that you might have. You can go ahead. Thank you. Yes, sir. Do you think it's possible to test away the negative effects before we eat? To test away? Yeah. I'm not sure what you mean by the negative effects. Well, maybe not negative effects, but just the negative perception. I don't know. Maybe I'll answer your question a little I'm not sure. Indirectly. Let me just tell you a story, okay? this may not answer your question, but I remember when I did that article for Feedstuffs, and I was sitting at NCBA, and I was at a breakfast, and sitting next to someone who was reading that article, and he didn't realize that was me. And then afterwards, he turned to me, and he said, "I just read your article. I want you to know I'm very disappointed in it." And I said, "Well, I thought I did a lot of work, and I was trying to be pretty objective." He said, "Well, I'm losing $150 a head for every animal that's imported." And I said, "But, you're gaining all this money when you get to export. It's a two-way kind of street." Now, the question is, do you want to be involved in that? Do you just want to shut off and then have the right to send stuff out? He didn't have a good answer for that. It's a two-way street. The question is, can we label? Can we create a differential demand? I think so. Will you test necessarily? No, but you certainly can. We can create a private traceability system. You say, hey, this is our product. We advocate our story. I've always believed that really, I think as an industry, we could do much better for ourselves privately, advocating our story and really getting that out and creating some value versus having kind of a mandate, because ultimately what happens in it, everybody's playing on the same field. I'm not sure I answered your question, but well, I think the question becomes then, relative to safety, is why is cattle imported from Mexico or Canada any less safe than cattle from the United States when they're all going through the exact same inspection system with the same amount of knowledge? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, sir.
In the early part of your talk, you made reference to a number of key economists, and earlier you talked about socialistic principles with those references. How do we in agriculture that's been so heavily driven and capitalistic approaches blend those into our business?
I think that's a great question. I think that's really a very, very ultimate question, and I think in some ways we're a little bit kind of behind the eight ball, because all of a sudden we cleaned up our mess 20 years ago. We went through this. We were over leveraged. We've deleveraged over value assets, and we said, okay, now we have subsidies, and I don't want to get into all of that, but largely we're a capitalist system. We're going to work on the free markets, and now all of a sudden we're not getting a whole lot of that in terms of business. Now we may get rural kind of development types of things, but ultimately we're kind of behind the eight ball relative to a lot of these other industries. And what I also find interesting, I had this conversation this morning, is and I live in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Okay, it's the home of Corvette, GM. Let me tell you, it's very interesting to talk to people about unions and auto plants there. But somehow, none of us, we're small relative, and we're not going to get any help, but they're all too big to fail. And yet, we've also not allowed JBS and National to merge, and it seems a little bit of a double standard. So, yeah, I think it's a great question. And how do you function in that? I think that's really the $1 million question.
Okay.
Okay.